Hello, welcome to your lecture on the many senses. In this lecture, we will address the overarching question of how stimulation from the external environment impacts the body and the brain to influence or shape behavior. In the process, we're going to look at the visual system, the auditory system, the body senses, including chemical senses and of smell and taste, and the somatosensory system that processes touch and pain.
And at this point, I'd like for us to transition and into a discussion about really where the rubber hits the road in terms of the functioning of our brain as a processor of sensory information and our perception. So I'd like for you, with all this knowledge about the brain in the background, to consider how animals live in the world, privy to different kinds of information, not merely by virtue of their particular ecological niches, but also by virtue of what they attend to. So we as humans inhabit a particular sensory world that is distinct from other members of the animal kingdom. And that has to do with us living a terrestrial lifestyle. If we were fishes, then we would live in an aquatic world that would make us privy to chemical information and very little information about light, and relatively little information about sound. And so the sensory world of fishes, of animals that are one-celled organisms that live in aquatic or semi-aquatic environments is very different than that of humans that are terrestrial and greatly emphasize visual and auditory ways of receiving information about the world. So in conjunction with this organization of the nervous system that exists to suit our behavioral functions, the nervous system, and that sort of manifests differently in different members of the animal kingdom. The body of animals is differently organized to suit their particular ecological niches. And another way to think about this sensory world is in terms of the German word Umwelt, which is different than Merkwelt. So each animal has a perceptual universe, a Merkwelt, that is unique, that may or may not overlap with the Umwelt of other animals that share its particular environment. So the image I have here is of Walden Pond, one of my favorite places back home in Massachusetts. And when I go swimming in Walden Pond, I'm able to appreciate the nice fresh water. It's a very spiritual place. But I also come out of the water and I walk on the sand, and we picnic, and at certain times of the year we can appreciate the turning of the leaves. So sometimes my Umwelt in the pond overlaps with the fishes, but at other points in time when I come out of the pond water itself and appreciate the foliage, my Umwelt doesn't overlap. So my Merkwelt, my perceptual universe, partially overlaps with the fishes, but not entirely. And so hopefully you'll understand what I mean about the difference between a sensory world and a perceptual world, and how they can sometimes and overlap, but not be completely parallel or coincident. Another way to think about this is in terms of how animals' bodies, not merely their brains, are organized. You can see here that four very closely related rodent species, the star-nosed mole, the masked shrew, the African hedgehog, and the eastern mole, have very different anatomical proportions relative to the motor or cortical homunculi that are illustrated here. So this is the anatomical proportion of a star-nosed mole. If you look at how much brain real estate it allocates to receiving and processing information and controlling movement of the same body areas, you can see that the brain real estate proportions are quite different, and they emphasize the forepaw and the snout quite disproportionately relative to other body areas. And that real estate allocation for brain functioning is different than what you see in the eastern mole. And a big difference between these two species is that one is diurnal, one is active during the day, and the other is nocturnal. If you're active at night, you're going to want to feel your way around and smell your way around more. By contrast, if you're active during the day, you'll spend more time, look at the eyes here, deciphering visual information than you do tactile or chemosensory information. Mechanical information or physical information is also something that's emphasized significantly in the eastern mole, despite its being more active during the day, because of the fact that it has these vibrissae that come out. So the importance of the niche of an animal not only correlates to its lifestyle, but also corresponds to, again, the allocation of brain real estate to important functions such as smelling and seeing. So raccoon and coati are a perfect example of this difference between diurnal and nocturnal functioning. You see here that the coati is diurnal, and it spends a lot more time, active during the day, obviously, but being privy to visual information. Consequently, it doesn't have a significant proportion of brain real estate allocated to feeling and smelling senses. So there are two sides of a coin. Despite their differences, all of our senses rely on a handful of principles. The external stimulus is converted by a sense receptor into neural activity through the process of transduction, and activation is highest when the stimulus is first detected, and then sensory adaptation occurs. That's why by the end of the day you don't feel that scratchy label at the collar of your shirt. There's sensory adaptation that unfolds and helps you to get used to it, so that you're not constantly alerted to the fact that it's there, which would be very annoying. So there's sensation and there's perception, and illusion is what happens wherever there's a disconnect or a mismatch between what we perceive and what is actually there in reality. So psychophysics is the study of how we perceive sensory information based on their physical attributes. And there's some principles of psychophysics that are worth mentioning here, including the absolute threshold, the just noticeable difference, and Weber's law, which I'll let you read the definitions of before moving on. So we attend to multiple senses at once. This is called parallel processing. We also process information from the bottom up or the top down. And there are perceptual sets which occur when our expectations influence our perceptions. So after being transduced, our brains then organize sensory data into meaningful concepts. They piece together information, and the fact that we have illusions demonstrates the importance of cross-sensory modality, or the fact that our senses integrate in their interpretation of information as it is specific to the context. So there's some good hyperlinks here in this slide that I'd like you to refer to and check out some really useful visual illustrations, video illustrations, in fact, on some of the illusions that help us to actually understand better the functioning of the brain and the nervous system as it interacts with the environment. One of the great mysteries of psychology is just how our brains combine all the various kinds of information that we receive into a coherent whole. The look, the feel, the smell of an apple all rely on different sensory areas to appreciate, and yet we are able to conclude when we combine all of that information that we have an apple. Selective attention is one of those things that is useful in terms of understanding how there can be a difference between your Umwelt and your Merkwelt. So we have an ability, sometimes we're constrained in terms of what we can attend to, and sometimes by choice or in terms of where we find ourselves. So whether I find myself in the pond water or outside of the pond water, when I'm outside of the pond water, I'm better able to appreciate the foliage. I can better attend to and am more privy to that kind of information. So we selectively attend to things depending on what channel we're processing information through, where we find ourselves in a particular interaction, in a particular context. Subliminal information processing is an interesting phenomenon. We process a lot of different sensory inputs, some of which happens unconsciously. That doesn't necessarily mean that it is completely outside of our awareness. Sometimes we are processing information in a way that is completely outside of our awareness. At other times, depending on how plugged in we are to our physiological responses, we can tell whether something is at least basically comfortable or alarming, right? But we detect stimuli without knowing it. And in some cases, that is important in terms of its functions in changing our behavior in ways that are adaptive, self-preserving, or self-perpetuating in terms of their correspondence to survival and reproduction. Extrasensory perception, or ESP, is a sort of wonky extension of subliminal processing, right? The idea that perception of events outside of known channels of sensation exist. So parapsychologists aren't real psychologists. Remember, these are people who explore the paranormal, and there isn't any evidence really that ESP exists. It is, full of hoaxes and full of just misinformation, really, some of which relates to our discussion in Unit 1 about the need for skepticism and critical thinking, and the need to avoid common pitfalls in reasoning that can make people fall prey to exploitation, both personal and financial. So why people believe is, something worth studying from a psychological perspective. There have been lots of failed psychic predictions, including very specific things like, that a Nazi flag would be found on the moon, or that the Earth would suddenly end on a precise date. I remember all of the predictions about Y2K and how, that was just going to be the end of the world, and particularly in terms of our technological advancements. But it's important to remember that some things occur because of they're chance occurrences, and some things have an illusory or a false correlation with other phenomena. It doesn't mean that there is some paranormal or other activity underway. So an example that I use for explaining chance occurrences is the fact that you only need to have 23 people in a room before you have a 50% chance of one of those 23 people sharing the same birthday. It seems hard to believe considering there are 365 days of the year, but that's all you need is 23 people in a room before you have a 1 in 2 odds of two people sharing a birthday. So here is another link to a useful video illustration. But again, the brain is very important in terms of being where the rubber hits the road with regard to information coming in from the outside, from the environment, distilling in such a way that it can be processed, using our granular functions of our brain and our body, in a way that is meaningful and impactful in terms of its culmination in behavioral adjustment, right, or actions. So we're going to talk about the sensory systems more specifically now. So the visual system is comprised, not surprisingly, of the eye. Information goes into the eye, travels up the optic nerve, and is interpreted by the thalamus, the lateral geniculate nucleus, the parts of the parietal and the visual cortex here in the occipital lobe, some small parts of the temporal lobe. So what is the object we're seeing is discerned by the secondary visual cortex, the secondary visual association cortex down here. The occipital lobe houses the vast majority of our visual processing centers of the brain, importantly. But it's important to note that so many of the functions of our visual processing are distributed to multiple regions of the brain. And that is important because it means that you can't completely knock out someone's visual functions by knocking out, God forbid, through an aneurysm or stroke or a tumor, one small area of the brain because of the wide distribution of visual processing. That said, the eyes themselves are very important. And this is because they are the way that we gather information about light into the brain. So we see light through a narrow band of wavelength that overlaps but is, really pales in comparison to what a lot of other animals can see. Birds, for instance, can see into the ultraviolet range. And there is a really wonderful video narrated by David Attenborough that shows what, beautiful phenomena essentially are the patterns of coloration of birds that look colorful to us but are even more colorful when examined from a UV range. So other animals may have more restricted or a greater spectrum of light that they can receive and process. We perceive brightness or intensity and hue or color. And a mixing of lights produces an additive effect, as you see here, whereas a mixing of pigments produces a subtractive effect. So that's how we see white. White is all colors, and black is really the reduction of color. So the eye is made up of a number of different structures. Importantly, the iris is the colored portion that we see, and it is important for controlling how much light gets into the eye. So when we're in a bright environment, the pupils constrict, and that lets less light into the eye. When we are in darkness, the pupils dilate, they open up, and that lets more light into the eye. And the function of that is that the light will bounce off of the back of the eye, the fovea and the retina. We need more light interacting with those areas, those structures of the eye, in order to discern features of the environment in darkness, for example. The pupil is that hole that constricts or enlarges. The cornea contains transparent cells that focus light on the back of the eye, and the lens changes the curvature or accommodation to retract light onto the back of the eye. So glasses change the way that light enters the eye to help correct for myopia or hyperopia. And the retina is that thin membrane at the back of the eye that you see here. The fovea is responsible for visual acuity, and it's one of those telltale markers that you find in animals that are diurnal, because it also helps us to see color more distinctly, and color information is something you're going to need if you're active during the day. So if you find a nocturnal animal that has a fovea, chances are, and this has been demonstrated in newly nocturnal species of primates, that they once lived a diurnal lifestyle. So different cortical cells respond maximally to different types of stimuli. A feature detector cell allows us to detect lines and edges. They're simple cells and they're complex cells. And their orientation tells us something about how movement is unfolding. So to determine motion, the brain compares visual frames of what is happening currently to what has happened previously. Gestalt principles kind of emerged from that idea of Gestalt psychology, more about the wholeness. So are those that speak to rules governing our perception of objects as wholes, right? So the proximity of things, the similarity of things, how they are continuous or not continuous, whether there's closure, whether there's symmetry, figure and foreground, or background, are all examples of how we perceive images in their whole and not in their subcomponents. Color perception is has been explored through different theories, including trichromatic theory and opponent processing theory. It's important to note that color blindness is explained by trichromatic theory, the idea that there are three types of cones in the eyes that are responsible for discerning information about color. Opponent processing theory is important, though, in that it helps us to understand the complementarity of opposing colors, such as red versus green or blue versus yellow. Monocular depth and binocular depth are important functions of the eyes as well. So one thing you probably have noticed if you have a dog or a cat is that they have pretty good, they're able to jump, and they're able to land on their feet, and they're able to catch things. They have fairly good depth perception, and that's because their eyes face forward. If you look at a bird or a squirrel, you will probably notice that they tend to orient themselves sideways when they're examining something. Now, both squirrels and birds are really good at navigating the greatest heights and aren't afraid to fall because they have bodies, in the case of birds with wings, or in the case of squirrels with tails that help them avoid harming themselves when falling from great heights. But they have eyes that are side-facing, and sideways-facing eyes means that you don't have very good depth perception, and it requires, when you're orienting yourself to an object of study, that you stand parallel to that object and survey that object from a sideways stance, perhaps looking at examining it up and down as opposed to regarding it face on or head on. Depth perception is one of those strengths of being a human and having binocular vision with an area of overlap in terms of the range of sight, and that's where stereoscopy comes into play. Our real depth perception is in the areas that overlap. There are some visual illusions that are based on our brain's ability to jump to conclusions, essentially, to help us make better sense of the environment, essentially, but that lead to missteps in our perceptual ability. So a lot of people think that this line is longer, and in fact it's not. A lot of people think that the circle that's higher up is larger, or that this bar is smaller, and neither is true. It has to do with the sort of neurological devices that ordinarily exist to help us function in a three-dimensional world, when we're trying to perceive information on two dimensions, sometimes that leads to the arrival at false conclusions. Some other deceptive phenomena include this here, which line is longer. A lot of people will assume that the vertical line is longer. A lot of people will assume that the central circle is bigger in one of these images relative to the other. Again, we have brains that are constructed that have evolved for perceiving information in three dimensions that are quite constrained when having to make judgments about things in two dimensions. So when we can't see it, when we can't see accurately, it can be an error of perception due to those optical illusions I alluded to before, or in the case of some individuals, there can be some real native or constitutional deficits that make it impossible for them to see correctly. Blindness is an example of that. There's also motion blindness. Visual agnosia and blind sight are two really fascinating neurological anomalies. There's a YouTube video I include a link to here from the Secrets of the Mind series with V.S. Ramachandran, a famous neuroscientist that I think you would enjoy. But color blindness is relatively common. Up to 10% of men and 1% of women experience some degree of color blindness, usually in the form of deuteranopia, which is red-green color blindness. And before I leave, actually, the topic of color blindness, let me remind you that cones are responsible for discerning color vision, not the rod. So when the cones have all the various photopigments, which are called colors, then your eye sees all possible colors. If there's a problem with the pigments in the cones, then you won't see the colors that you should, and essentially the color blindness ensues. Hearing is a very important sense, and if you happen to be blind, then it, along with your tactile sensory abilities, tend to manifest more prominently. The fancy way to talk about the sense of hearing is to refer to the sense of audition, or the auditory sense. And basically, in parallel to the way that sight is based on our interpretation of light that comes into the brain, sound is based on our interpretation of physical vibrations that come into the ear and or are felt by surfaces of the body. So traveling through air, for instance, sound travels through water as well. Consequently, fishes and mammals that live in the ocean make sounds that are sometimes discernible to us as well. The pitch, the wave frequency will vary depending on whether you are in aquatic environment or terrestrial environment. And so loudness, amplitude, timbre, the complexity of sounds, as well as pitch, all contribute to our appreciation and perception of of sounds. So when you're trying to determine the location of a sound, the ear that it hits first, the ear that is initially impacted by the vibration, is that ear which indicates where the source of the sound is emanating from. The outer, middle, and inner ear do different jobs in terms of their transducing sound to neural activity. The outer ear, which includes the pinna and the ear canal, tunnels sound waves into the eardrum, and on the other side of the eardrum, the ossicles, which are these tiny little bones, the hammer, anvil, and stirrup, vibrate and transmit sound to the inner ear. And the cochlea converts vibration into neural activity. So cochlear implants are used in individuals who have deafness that can be remedied by a mechanical intervention that will do what the inner ear structures cannot, in terms of transmitting information about vibration into signals that can be interpreted by the cochlear nerve. Chemical senses are really, really fascinating, actually, even in terms of their relationship with human behavior. So humans are quite notorious for not having very elaborate or developed or derived, evolutionarily speaking, sensory abilities in terms of smell and taste. But we do have a sort of vestigial vemeronasal organ, and we are able to sense and, that is, receive and process information about a wide array of smells. And the chemical senses, because they're all based on smell and taste, are kind of unified. It's really hard to just smell something and not taste it. And it's equally hard to taste something and not smell it. You probably have experienced the phenomenon where foods taste differently when you're congested, when you aren't privy to information from both taste and smell in a combined fashion. So that sort of is a testament to how integral they are in their relationship to one another. Either way, food that you taste and smell impacts the orbitofrontal cortex and also parts of the brainstem, the olfactory bulb, and that is interpreted in ways that attribute to our appreciation or our repulsion. We also have, because of this ability to make connections with and behaviorally respond to smells and tastes, or the chemicals that are at their foundation, entire industries that have developed, such as the perfume industry. The first perfumes that were referred to as musks were actually based on sweat from boars, male pigs, musky smells that are often considered sexy, particularly of women, by women around ovulation, tend to have high levels of androgens or androgenic type hormones in their chemical makeup. So that's something that we'll talk about later on when we talk about behavior, and particularly pheromones or chemical signals that are used to communicate between members of different species as well as within species for the purposes, again, of survival and reproduction. So somatosensory abilities are those abilities of our body, the physical senses of our body that include our touch and pain sensory abilities, our kinesthetic abilities, and our vestibular senses. So somatosensory system refers to touch and pain. Proprioception is really about movement and awareness of one's body in space. And the vestibular sense is about our balance and equilibrium in space. So the somatosensory pathways really represent the avenue through which physical information about our environment informs our body sensations. So somatic nerves carry information to the spinal cord. So now we're talking about some of the this intersection between the peripheral nervous system and the central nervous system. Spinal reflexes may be activated. This connects to the brainstem and thalamus. In the case of touch, association cortices may be triggered. And in the case of pain, our somatosensory cortex and limbic areas that are involved in emotional processing can be activated. Pain is one of these very complicated things that is a source of great suffering for many Americans, particularly in this day of greater awareness of fibromyalgia and other chronic pain conditions. So there are many different kinds of pain, and they often relate to the stimuli that cause pain. Some people are more sensitive to pain, maybe because of a personal individual traumatic history. I have a friend who is a pain doctor in town, and I've talked to other physicians who treat patients with chronic pain, and they often speak to the fact that many of their patients will have some history of emotional trauma, perhaps that makes them more vulnerable or more sensitive, reducing their threshold for sensation to pain. But in the skin, there are a number of different kinds of receptors. The pain receptors are located most superficially. The Ruffini endings and Pacinian corpuscles are really down low in the endodermis, and the Meissner's corpuscles are sort of intermediate. So a deep vibration and pressure are felt by Ruffini's ending and Pacinian corpuscles. The Meissner's corpuscles are responsible for us having the exquisite ability to discern changes in texture. So people's ability to feel and read through Braille is because of the Meissner's corpuscles, and they are concentrated in the most sensitive parts of our bodies, the lips, the face, particularly the tips of the fingers and the genitalia. And this is something that we have sharing in common with other non-human primates that have very exquisite touch sensory abilities. Proprioception is, again, our kinesthetic sense, helping us to keep track of where we are as we move. Think of the dancer or think of the athlete that has to have extraordinary control of their muscle movements and of their skeletal system, right? Vestibular senses are really important for maintaining our balance and equilibrium. And interestingly, they overlap with the functions of hearing. So the fluid in the semicircular canals of the inner ear is an integral component in our ability to maintain our sense of balance and equilibrium. It's kind of like the leveling devices that you buy at the hardware store with that liquid that where the bubble in the center shows that you're at balance when you're trying to brace two 2x4s. The semicircular canals are essentially that way, and in terms of how they help us to discern, to some extent subliminally, about our sense of balance. If you're on a boat, you're all over the place. That sloshing of fluid, not merely outside of you as it hits the boat, but also inside the semicircular canals, indicates a lack of balance that correlates with nausea and being ill at ease. It's also the case that if you suffer from an ear infection, you're more likely to feel disruption in your sense of equilibrium.